Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Please subscribe and keep watching more details. Mike Wolfe describes first-hand account of Frank Fritz's death. When Frank Fritz died, Mike Wolfe said he was at his former American Pickers star's side. Mike has now revealed how the final moments of Frank's life went and what happened when his longtime friend passed away. Here is what Mike said about Frank's death and the final moments of his friend's life. Mike Wolfe was with Frank Fritz when he died. Mike Wolfe said he was by his longtime friend Frank Fritz's side when he died. Mike said that he was sitting by him as he passed away and held his hand in the end. Mike also talked a little about his friend and what he meant to him and the American Pickers community. He was a lot like he was on camera. He was very sensitive. He was very caring. He was extremely funny. His sense of comedic timing was unbelievable. Wolfe said about Frank via people. Actually, the crew and myself would always tell him that he should do stand-up, because he was always very self-deprecating. Mike said that Frank was someone that anyone could talk to and feel comfortable with. He said that Frank would make sure everyone knew that he heard them. Mike and Frank first met in middle school and bonded as two kids who grew up without dads. They said that the struggles they faced in life made them stronger. Mike said Frank was a hard worker, and he had never met anyone like him. He also said that Frank was the only person who didn't make fun of him when he came up with the idea of American Pickers. Mike Wolfe and Frank Fritz fell out but reconnected before death. Mike Wolfe and Frank Fritz had a falling out after Frank ended up back in rehab for his addiction issues. After that, Frank had back surgery, and American Pickers fired him while he was in recovery. Frank said Mike never came to see him during his recovery. There were a lot of things that were said that weren't true, and I always continued to pray for him, Mike said. But unfortunately, the things that we want for someone, sometimes, it's just not enough, and they have to want these things for themselves. Mike said the network made the decision to cut Frank, not him. However, Frank blamed him and their friendship ended. Mike said it was like losing a brother, and that's why it was so hard to hear him say the things that he said. However, they made up with each other after Frank suffered his stroke. I was there for about an hour before he passed, and I was holding his hand and rubbing his chest when he took his last breath, Mike said. I took my fingers and I closed his eyes. In the dimly lit corner of an old Midwestern diner, Mike Wolfe leaned back, his eyes a little weary but kind. The news of Frank Fritz's passing had hit him hard. It wasn't unexpected, but that didn't soften the blow. As he stirred his coffee absently, his gaze drifted to the far wall where a photograph of the two of them, taken over a decade ago, hung in a modest frame. It was during one of their earliest picking trips, both grinning wide, arms slung around each other, dusty caps pushed back on their heads. Those were the days, long road trips, the thrill of the find, the banter that was half brotherly bickering, half friendship. Mike took a deep breath, as if trying to find his footing in a flood of memories, and began. Frank was, well, he was one of a kind, we all knew that. If you watched him on the show, you saw the laughs, the quirks, the way he'd size something up with that skeptical, no-nonsense expression. But what you might not have seen was how big Frank's heart was. Sure, he could be gruff, and he'd never back down from an argument. We'd go toe-to-toe on things, both of us too stubborn for our own good sometimes. But underneath all that, Frank cared. He cared about me, about what we were doing, and about the people we met along the way. Mike paused, his fingers tracing a ring around the edge of his coffee cup. The last time we spoke, it wasn't the way I'd wanted things to end between us. You know, life just gets complicated and people drift apart, but that didn't mean I ever stopped thinking about him. Frank was part of my life for a long, long time. It's hard to imagine any of this without him. He shook his head slowly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He had this laugh, this deep, rumbling laugh that would just take over a room. And his jokes, well, let's just say they weren't always appropriate. But they were always Frank. If we pulled up to a barn, and I started getting all excited about some dusty old thing we found, he'd be right there, telling me I was crazy for wanting to spend good money on what he'd call someone else's junk. But that was the balance. He kept me grounded. Mike looked up, his eyes shimmering slightly. I remember one time we were driving through Iowa, hitting the back roads. Frank was in one of his moods, head lost out on an old neon sign he'd had his eye on, and he was grumbling about it for miles. But then we pulled into this yard, full of vintage motorcycles. Frank's face lit up like a kid at Christmas. I swear, I'd never seen him happier. He must have walked around that yard 5 or 6 times, touching each bike, checking the frames, talking to the owner. He bought 2 of them on the spot and spent the whole drive back talking about how he was going to fix them up. That was Frank. He'd grumble, he'd complain, but when he found something he loved, man, he was all in. The diner's hum seemed to grow quieter, as if the other patrons were listening in. Mike's voice dropped a little, almost as if he was talking to himself. Losing him. It's strange, you know. It's like a part of my own story is gone too. We were partners, we were friends, and we were family. In that strange, messy way family happens sometimes. Frank and I went through a lot together. Good times, tough times. We fought, we laughed, we learned a whole lot more about each other than most people ever will. He closed his eyes, lost in thought. People always ask me if I regret not fixing things up with him sooner. And yeah, there's a part of me that wishes we patched things up. But Frank knew how I felt, even if I didn't get the chance to tell him face to face. And I know he cared about me too, in his own frank way. A lump formed in his throat as he continued, his words now almost a whisper. I just wish I'd been able to be there for him more at the end. He had his battles, and I know it wasn't easy. Frank was a proud guy. He didn't like showing weakness, didn't like asking for help. But we all struggle in our own ways. I hope he knew that he wasn't alone, even if we didn't always say it. Taking a deep breath, Mike straightened, a small, bittersweet smile returning. There's a lot I'll miss about him. The banter, the way he'd tease me, how he'd bring me back down to earth when I got too carried away. But mostly, I'll miss his friendship. Frank was more than just a guy I worked with. He was family. And you can't replace family. You carry them with you every single day. He nodded, more to himself than anyone else, as if he'd made peace with something. So, if you ever find yourself out on a back road, with nothing but the wind in your hair and a long stretch of highway ahead, give Frank a thought. He'd have loved that. It's where he was happiest on the road, surrounded by history, a little dust, and a whole lot of stories waiting to be told. As Mike got up to leave, he looked back at the picture one last time, his gaze softening. Rest easy, old friend, he murmured. Thanks for the memories. And with that, he walked out into the morning light, carrying the spirit of his friend with him, just as he always would. The morning sunlight filtered through the old, tattered curtains in Mike Wolfe's kitchen. Outside, the crisp autumn air lay heavy, marking the close of another picking season. The faint smell of coffee and old leather hung in the room as Mike sat, hands clasped around a chipped mug, eyes distant. This wasn't just any day, not for Mike. He was here to do something he'd never imagined he'd have to do. Talk about the passing of his friend and former co-host, Frank Fritz. Mike shifted in his seat, his eyes tracing the familiar outline of the room. It felt like a safe space, a space where he could bring to life the memories of a friendship that spanned decades, a friendship built on backroads, rusted antiques, and shared dreams. Frank was more than a partner, he started, his voice low and gravelly. Frank was my brother. We didn't always see eye to eye, and anyone who watched us on American Pickers knows that. But that was what made us work. He'd tell me what he thought straight up. No sugarcoating, no dancing around the truth. It was one of the things I respected most about him. Mike paused, eyes fixed on a spot across the room as if it held 1,000 stories. He sipped his coffee, letting the silence fill with memories. I remember one of our first picks, years before the show ever happened. We were in this old barn in Indiana, knee-deep in dust, surrounded by piles of rusted tools and farming equipment. I was like a kid in a candy store, trying to find that perfect piece, that treasure buried under layers of forgotten years. Frank was practical. He'd stand there, arms crossed, just watching me dig through junk, shaking his head. He'd say, "Mike, why are we wasting time on this pile of garbage?"